Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So today I would like to speak to you about computational photography. In particular, I want to trace out a history, and hopefully this will be entertaining from two completely different perspectives. One is that I hope to give you a historical perspective on computational imaging and how it has made it into mobile phones. And second is I want to give you some technical details about some of the aspects of the technology that I have been fortunate to be involved in both as an academic and also for the last 8 years at Google. Okay, so how the mobile phone became a camera. As I'm sure you would agree, the smartphone has really changed the world. In fact, the smartphone is really more of a camera than it is a phone nowadays. And there's plenty of evidence for this all over if you look a little bit carefully. In fact, the idea has become so obvious that we don't even think about it anymore. From an economic standpoint, a $1 trillion smartphone economy has spawned, and but that's not all. It has also fundamentally changed the way we interact with the world. Here's a piece of evidence you might find interesting. This is a picture from 2005, the Vatican Square when Pope Benedict was announced. I want to draw your attention to the lower right-hand corner of this image, where you'll see one lonely individual with a flip phone taking a picture of the scene. Now let's fast forward just a few years to 2013 when the next Pope, Pope Francis, was announced. And here you'll see that virtually everyone has a mobile device, everything from tablets to phones, taking a picture of the scene. And this is a fundamental transformation in the way we remember our world, we capture our world, and so on. In fact, smartphones have caused a photography boom. It used to be that you would have to buy an actual camera to photograph things, but nowadays, 85%, this is from 2017, so it's probably closer to 90% now, of all the photos taken in the world are taken on smartphones. Only about 10% are on digital cameras. And to put some numbers on it, more than 2 billion photos are shared on social media per day, which is kind of an astonishing number. And 100 million of those are selfies. Think about what that says about our world. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about the camera industry being very negatively impacted by this. And in fact, here's a picture where you can see that. The blue columns here indicate cameras built with built-in lenses, and the red is cameras with interchangeable lenses. And so put them together, and these are cameras that are not phones. And if you look at the market, it sort of peaked around 2010 and collapsed. In fact, it has collapsed by about 85% since 2010. So the history. There is a lot of history, of course. The photography dates back to the 1800s, and I'm not going to go through a lot of the details. And there's a very, very rich history here as well. So I'm going to call that old school and move on. Then there's the era of analog photography, which I'm going to say just one slide about that. Then digital photography spans the 90s. And finally, in the 2010s, I would say, critically, starting in 2010, the era of mobile and computational photography really has taken off. And so most of my talk will be concentrated in the section here that I have indicated in red. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about analog photography. So analog film dominated for about 50 years, and it was largely discontinued around 2005. The pioneer in this area was, of course, Kodak, but there were many other makers of the analog rolls as well. However, the digital photography is the main topic of today, and so let's talk about a little bit of a historical tour of what transpired here. The first digital camera prototype was built around 1975. In fact, there's an interesting history right there. I want to show you what this first digital camera looked like. If you look on the left-hand side, this blue thing here is the actual casing of the camera. There is a computer underneath it that controlled it. There is a cassette tape you can see here, and this cassette tape was in fact where the photograph was recorded. The resolution was very low, 100 by 100. It took about 20 seconds to shoot a single picture. And then if you wanted to play the picture back, you would have to take this cassette tape out, put it in this other microcomputer, and then you could play back the picture on a television screen. So the inventor of this technology at Kodak, interestingly enough, was a young engineer named Steve Sasson. And when he showed a prototype of this invention to the Kodak executives, they told them that they were convinced that no one would ever want to look at their pictures on a screen. Now imagine that. We almost look at nothing but screens now when it comes to pictures. So it was a very, very different world, obviously. But I wouldn't feel too bad for Steve Sasson. It's not like he's a forgotten inventor. He was, in fact, recognized for his efforts. 35 years later, he received the National Medal of Technology in 2009. Now, moving forward, the next, actually, let me say a little bit more about that era. It's kind of an interesting coincidence that around the same time the Polaroid camera was making its kind of round of popularity at the time. Now, if you think about what's happening in the world today with the social media, one of the things that drives all of that is instant gratification. And we have a tendency to think that instant gratification is just this very recent thing and it didn't exist before, but that's not really true. If you think back to the early days of Polaroid, that's exactly the motivation there as well. So the first digital cameras, the first commercial digital cameras, not prototypes, this took about, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 15 or 20 years to be made. And this is kind of what they look like. One of the interesting objects here to think about is this device called the Logitech Photoman. Very low resolution, black and white, kind of 256 gray levels, cost $1,000. So you wouldn't be surprised to hear that it actually didn't sell very many units. The things on the right look more like the cameras that we have today, and these had Nikon bodies and Kodak sensors. Basically, these were the first DSLRs. What's interesting is that there was solid state memory, of course, was very expensive and bulky. So if you wanted to capture photos with these cameras that had on the order of 1.5 or so megapixels, many of these cameras had to have external hard drives that were tethered to the device. And so, for example, here you see this huge thing. You actually had to carry it over your shoulder to take pictures. The cost was very high, around $20,000, and these devices in the very early days sold no more than 1,000 units. So they're very highly specialized things. Okay, the next kind of interesting transformation of technology was CMOS. Everything that I've talked about so far, all the cameras that were electronic were based on CCDs. And CMOS was invented in 1993. Well, I think that's when it was published, and it was quite revolutionary. These were very much cheaper devices. They were power efficient, but they were noisier and they had a rolling shutter readout. In fact, some of these technical limitations meant that it would take at least another 10 years before CMOS would become convenient enough and easy to produce, easy to mass produce, and affordable enough to power things like mobile and digital cameras. And of course, now they dominate. Um, Digital SLRs and compacts. So let's talk a little bit about that. So here we're talking about in the early 2000s. Thinking about this, there were sort of two sets of devices available at the time. The Canon PowerShot, as an example of the kind of point and shoot devices that were available. They cost around $500. And then the SLRs, still based on CCD technology, were 2 to 3 megapixel resolution. They had a decent amount of internal memory, so that you didn't have to have this external thing you carried around, and they cost around $3,000 to $5,000. Now, if you fast forward to today and look at the cameras, the point and shoot cameras. So let me just show you again these devices. The point and shoot were $500 or so. The early DSLRs were $3,000 to $5,000. And if you look at the devices now, prices are about the same. For the point and shoots like the Sony RX100, which is an excellent camera, and for the Nikon D810, $3,000 to $5,000. So what's interesting, what's happened is that the value has really improved. You get many more pixels, you get terrific optics, and the prices are the same. So you can think about a camera as sort of price per pixel has really gone down for the consumer. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about. So I've spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about photography, generally speaking, but now I want to talk about mobile photography and the recent history of that. So the electronic camera with programmable transmission capability was a patent that was filed in 1997. And you might be surprised to hear that this patent was also filed by Kodak. So you've heard Kodak now many times throughout the last 12 minutes or so. Now, what's interesting is if you look at this picture here on the left-hand corner, you see that it almost looked like a modern day, or at least a mobile phone from the late 1990s. Unfortunately, Kodak didn't really follow up and pursue this technology as much as they might have. They were afraid that it would cut into their analog photography business. And so as a result, others took it over. And the first commercial camera phone, which you see up there, was in fact built in Japan. It was called the J phone. The company that made it was Sharp. It was very expensive, again, on the order of $500. And it took pictures that looked like this portrait on the left-hand side. The competing devices, which were the point and shoot cameras at the same time, were about the same price, and they took much better pictures. So again, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that these didn't really sell very well. On the other hand, the flip phones were the things that really became popular. And the first camera flip phone in the US appeared about 2 years later. And a year after that, in around 2003, the same cameras were equipped now with not only a rear-facing camera, but also with a front-facing camera. And they called it, at the time, they called it video call cameras. And this is, of course, the grandfather of the so-called selfie camera that is so ubiquitous nowadays. Okay, now this next event is really critical to what happened, and that was the introduction of the iPhone. The iPhone was introduced in 2007, and it was kind of a revolutionary device, but not for reasons that you might think. Did Apple reinvent the camera with the introduction of the iPhone? Not really. What they did is they did reinvent the phone, and they did reinvent the display and the user interface. If you look at the competing devices at the time, they had hard-built keyboards. They weren't very flexible. Their displays were not very interesting. You couldn't really show pictures or any kind of rich material, rich media. And so, yes, they did reinvent the phone, but not the camera. In fact, the camera was kind of an afterthought. Steve Jobs gave a really lovely and now famous 45-minute keynote during the introduction of the iPhone. And he said one single sentence about the camera. He said, on the back, the biggest thing of note is that we've got a 2-megapixel camera built right in. And it's no surprise in the sense that the competition were still compact cameras, which were getting cheaper, and the quality was increasing. So yes, it was a transition point, but mobile cameras were still a little ways from becoming commonplace and high enough quality to replace a separate camera. Okay, so now what happened? How did we go from the early iPhone that didn't really have a very interesting camera on it to where we are today? That in itself is an interesting and rich piece of recent history. A couple of things that I believe happened that really facilitated this transition were displays and networks, high-speed networks. So during around 2010, we transitioned from 3G to 4G, and we transitioned to 300 DPI displays. So let me say a little bit about that. This, by the way, I find a fascinating illustration of the size of cameras, size of phones from the early 90s to present day, and how they shrank and they got really small and then they grew again in terms of the display. But again, around 2010, the screen resolution for these devices hit 300 DPI, which is roughly equivalent to what you would see on a laptop screen. And so what was important there was that this enabled you to not only, it enabled you to really enjoy photographs on the screen of your mobile device. And this hadn't been the case before. So this was a really important transition point where people felt like their phones' screens were rich enough for consumption of photos. So the other thing that happened was that as we transitioned from 3G to 4G, the amount of time it would take to transmit an average pixel, an average image with 2 megapixels was drastically reduced. We went from something that would take around 30 seconds, completely impractical, not really social activity, to something that would take only half a second. And so with the combination of these two factors, the large display, 300 DPI, and the sharing being so quick, what that did is it allowed devices to take pictures, consume the pictures on the device, but also immediately shared with other people who could in turn enjoy them on their device. And that kind of spurred the entire ecosystem of iPhone, and then of course the other manufacturers followed suit. So I think 2010 in this brief history was a really critical point in time where this transition happened from small devices with bad cameras and small screens to larger devices with very good cameras and very high resolution screens. In this part, I'll be describing some of the more technical aspects of computational photography. And in particular, we'll be looking at some of the most recent developments. It's worthwhile saying that this era is really summarized well by the following mantra, which is to say that the best camera is the one that's with you. Our aim here has been to produce a camera that goes along with your phone that you would be carrying with you anyway, and make that camera as close as possible to a device that you would have to carry separately. So a recent history at Google, I became involved with the Google Glass device in 2012 when I came to Google to help with the camera pipeline for that device. That pipeline then evolved into the HDR Plus pipeline that made its way into the Nexus devices and later into the Pixel devices that are on the market today. So one of the most important questions here worth asking is, can a mobile device ever be as good as a large format camera? And of course, there's physical limitations, so one might expect the answer to that be perhaps a qualified no. Maybe we can get close, but we can't get all the way over there. So it's not hard to see that there are huge physical limitations that we face. So for example, the mobile camera in this example uh, basically measures 300 times less light just because of the size of its aperture. But it's also not just about the aperture, it's also the format of the sensor. If you look at something like 6 millimeter versus 35 millimeter, that has all sorts of implications for the size of the pixels and the noise floor and the light collection ability of these devices. So these are all barriers to achieving this ultimate goal. But maybe we can get close. So a lot of companies began to compete to show that they're getting close to these other devices with hardware. And so you've had this, what used to be a megapixel race has turned into a multi-camera race. So you have cameras, one camera devices, two camera devices, three, four, five. Interestingly enough, though, if you look under the hood, what you'll see is that the most significant improvements are actually due to software. And furthermore, the multiple cameras that were placed in these devices, each of them has a different function. So, for example, you can have a wide camera, you can have an ultra wide camera, then you can have a telephoto camera. So the light collection ability of these multiple devices doesn't really integrate into a better camera, but each of them kind of does some separate function. So regardless, the things that we want out of these smaller light form factor devices are we want more light collection ability, we want better dynamic range, and we want resolution. Those are sort of the three main axes along which these small form factor devices are deficient. So how do we go about that? Well, one can imagine for collecting more light, we could use a flash, but that, first of all, doesn't produce particularly interesting pictures. And furthermore, flash has a very limited range, just a few meters, and beyond that is pretty much useless. We can also take longer or bracketed exposures. Longer exposures, of course, are great. They get you more light, but they also get you motion blur. Bracketed exposure, if you just take a pair of images at different exposure levels and fuse them together, that's very difficult to do as well because aligning images that are at very different exposures is quite complicated. So there is an option that we settled on, and I think at this point most of the industry has certainly settled on and adopted, and that's to capture a burst. And this burst gives you the flexibility to do various things and various trade-offs in the most convenient way possible. The idea behind this is that you capture a burst of frames, not just a couple of frames, but something more like 5, 10, or 15 frames, depending on the scenario. And you align and merge them together to get one high-quality photo. So I want to say a little bit more about this burst photography modality, and this has become kind of the workhorse of computational photography in the last few years. So the first component of this is that you are going to design an exposure control algorithm. You look at the scene, your device is going to look at the scene, and based on both the light level that it senses and the range of the dynamic range that it senses, the brightest thing and the darkest thing in the scene, it decides how to take a total exposure time and sort of slice it up into smaller components that would be assigned to different frames. So in the case of the HDR Plus pipeline, traditionally we used a single exposure that was adapted to the scene that was given, and all the pictures that we take are underexposed so that we don't lose the highlights. The next step is that these images would be aligned together, and for that you would need reliable optical flow because the scene is never stationary, whether it's due to objects in the scene moving or the hand motion. And then the step after that is to merge. This isn't simply about averaging because, again, alignment is not perfect, and you also have things like occlusion, you have parallax, and so on and so forth. So this is actually a very, very sensitive step in the process. And then once you've got a single frame, you still have to do some single frame image processing to produce the final result. And that can include single frame denoising, sharpening, contrast enhancement, and dynamic range adjustments. Okay, so let's contrast this burst photography pipeline to the traditional pipeline. In the traditional pipeline, typically a single image is captured, and that single image is captured with a Bayer filter applied on it. And you can see here that what that means is that every pixel is not capturing every color. And those colors have to be interpolated in order to produce a final image. That capture is then gain controlled and white balanced and so on. And that key step here, demosaicing, is the one that's sort of equivalent to the merge step. Here you're using the nearby pixels in order to fill in the missing colors. The rest of these steps are enhancement steps, sort of like what I described before, leading to a final JPEG image that is stored on your device. Okay, so as I mentioned, demosaicing, this is one of the key components, and in fact, I think it's fair to say it's kind of the Achilles heel of the traditional pipeline. When you buy a camera that claims to have a 12 megapixel sensor, that does not mean you have 12 million RGB pixels measured. In fact, 2 out of 3 colors are always missing, and so that's what we're trying to interpolate here and fill in. How do we do it? We use some fancy nonlinear interpolation and fill in the missing pixels. So the bottom line is 2/3 of your picture is made up, and I think the average consumer probably doesn't know that, and maybe that's better. As I think people would want to ask for a refund if they did. Okay, so what does demosaicing look like, and how can we improve it? So here's an example of what a raw Bayer image looks like. That's the picture of this rectangle here that I've drawn in red. So demosaicing produces from the image on the left the image on the right, and as you can see, it produces results that don't really contain a lot of detail, and it produces artifacts. And because this process is being done so early in the pipeline, those errors tend to propagate throughout the process and cause damage further down the line. What we'd like to do is to replace this demosaicing step with multiple frames and produce the image on the right. That image, as you can see, contains a lot more detail in it, although it is not perfect either. So ideally, how could we do this? One approach that exists for doing multi-frame capture is something called pixel shifting. As some of you might know, this technology already exists in some fancy mirrorless cameras, standalone cameras. So here's what pixel shifting does. This is a cartoon that tries to illustrate, a perfect scenario. So suppose you have a single image here, the RGB that you're able to see. And now we're going to take this image and shift the sensor to the right by exactly 1 pixel. What this is going to do is, in fact, it's going to introduce some new color images, some color pixels that you previously did not have access to. The next thing we can do is to consider shifting the sensor down by 1 pixel. What this is going to do is to fill in some additional pixels. And finally, we're going to shift the sensor down and to the right by 1 pixel. And that is going to basically complete a final sweep of all the missing pixels and fill in all the RGB values. As I said, some mirrorless cameras do in fact have such a mode. However, the camera needs to be placed on a tripod, and it's a very precise process, and nothing can be moving in the scene, etc., etc. Okay, but life is not so simple with this idealized scenario that I described. We want to be able to do this on a mobile device. So how do we do it? Well, let me explain why it's not so simple. Things are moving kind of randomly, and so these pixels from low resolution capture are going to be spread onto a higher resolution grid, maybe in this particular form, and then each additional image that's captured is going to scatter its pixels onto this higher resolution grid, if you like. And some pixels are going to get multiple measurements of color, some pixels are going to get just one, and some pixels are going to get none. So at the end of the day, what you have is a multidimensional, non-uniform interpolation problem that you need to solve. And if you do solve that well, you're going to get your RGB full frame from multiple input images. So here you're doing kind of simultaneously, you're doing demosaicing and super resolution together. And I'll say more about that short. Okay, so where does the motion in mobile imaging come from? Well, obviously, as I indicated, there's two sources. One is the objects in the scene that may be moving, and the second one is your hand motion. And this is an illustration of a burst of photographs that was captured just outside of our office last year. And you can see the very global motion that's due to the hand tremor. If I show you a little chunk of that image, you can see this is what it looks like. We can align these frames together, and hopefully that large motion will go away. And this is what it looks like when I do that. However, even after I do that, things are still moving. And it turns out these very tiny motions, the very large motions are corrected for by the optical image stabilization that exists on almost all the mobile cameras. However, the small motion, it cannot be corrected by optical image stabilization and is still there. What you also see is effective aliasing. But let's talk about the small movements. Where did they come from? Well, it turns out that there's a very interesting and well-known phenomenon called natural physiological tremor. This has been observed since 1886. It's been written about in neurology journals for many, many years. And effectively, it turns out that if you hold your hand steady, or you try to, while holding an object, even while not holding an object, you can't hold your hand perfectly steady. You have these kind of constant movements that are very small. And these are things that manifest themselves in tiny movements in the images that you capture in a burst of images captured very quickly, one after the other. Here on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the horizontal versus the vertical angular displacement that we've measured in hundreds of bursts captured by photographers using one of our Pixel phones. So you can see it has this kind of distribution. And this is precisely what we use to get the tiny movements, even though they're random, they're useful to us, the tiny movements that will allow us to do this multi-frame demosaicing and super resolution simultaneously. So you might ask, what would happen if I took this mobile device where you're relying on hand movement and I put it on a tripod? People do that. What would happen then? Well, we do something interesting here, and that is we actually use the optical image stabilization and we turn the problem on its head. And when we detect that the object, the phone is not moving because it's been immobilized, we simulate a tremor by moving the image that falls onto the focal plane array using the optical image stabilizer in a controlled fashion. So you can see, if you look in the middle of this image, you can see tiny movements. And then again, so that's the trick that we play. And this is active in all the Pixel phones that run our super resolution algorithms. Okay, so here's an example of what things look like. There's a little chunk of this image that I want to show you. So basic idea here is aliasing plus phase diversity, meaning the images are subsampled, which is the case in most mobile phones, and phase diversity comes from the random movements that we're getting. These allow us to integrate the pixels together and to get multi-frame super resolution, which results in the output on the right-hand side. Interestingly enough, it turns out that our visual system appears to do something very similar. If you're asked to, and I apologize for this slightly freaky picture of the eye looking at you, but bear with me for a moment. It turns out that the eye has very minute movements called microsaccades, and these turn out to enhance fine spatial detail as well. The exact mechanism by which this happens is still debatable. However, it appears to be something similar because the number of rods and cones that we have in our eyes simply don't explain the resolution with which we appear to see the world. Okay, so I talked about this non-uniform interpolation problem, so let's say a little bit more about that. So if you look at the canvas of the pixel values that we measure, there may be areas in this canvas where there's dense coverage, many pixels are available, many colors are available, and there may be other areas which are very, very sparsely sampled. This is a fact that we have to deal with. The way we go about doing this is we use a non-parametric technique, which we've borrowed and further developed from the non-parametric statistics literature, called kernel regression. So the idea is the following. So let's say you have a bunch of measurements as indicated by these round circles. And for each of these measurements, basically we assign a kernel function. And these kernel functions will be adapted both in their size and their shape according to what other measurements are available in the vicinity or what colors are available in the vicinity. These bumps associated to each of these measurements will then be added together, weighted. Some of these things will give you then a continuous interpolation of a signal, which is an approximation of the underlying image. Once you have this continuous interpolation, then you can resample it onto any grid that you like. And this is kind of how we get to the final result. Therefore, it is possible for us to take images at a certain resolution and both merge them onto that same native resolution of the sensor. So, 12 megapixels, for example, or we can merge onto a higher resolution grid because we have this continuous interpolation in hand. Here I'm showing you examples of merging onto the native resolution, which I've denoted here by 1x, merging onto a 1.5x resolution and merging onto a 2x resolution. And you might wonder, how far can we push this? Maybe we can just keep going, 2x, 3x, 10x. We cannot. This is very much dependent on the noise available in the input images, the noise present in the input images, and also the amount of aliasing available. So depending on the pixel and lens spot trade-off, for a typical mobile sensor in good light conditions, the limit is about 2x. So this thing on the right is about as far as you can go with this native merge technique. If you want to go to higher resolution, I will explain how we do that in a little bit. Okay, so speaking of these kernels and how we adapt them to different parts of the image, here's a hugely blown up example that shows you what these kernels look like in flat areas and detailed areas and in edge areas. And as you can see, they kind of adapt their shape to what might be the underlying structure. Okay, so from a practical point of view, how does this all work? We do this using a gather process. I mean, you might think that the way I explain the way we integrate the weights together, that sounds like a kind of scatter process, but it's actually implemented as a gather process, which can be conveniently parallelized. So each image is basically aligned with the grid. Its contribution is estimated, and the samples are accumulated then into a final image. And that's repeated for every input image that comes in into a buffer. So here's some examples of what these things look like. This is a detail area that I'm showing from a full picture. These on the right-hand side, the crops that I've shown. The left-hand side is the standard HDR plus pipeline. And the right-hand side is this updated version that does the multi-frame demosaicing and super resolution together. And so here you can see the details of the Golden Gate Bridge emerging. Here's another example. This is this little cabin pretty far away. If you look at the structure on the roof of this cabin, you can clearly see the aliasing components in the top image from the standard pipeline, and on the bottom image you can see some of these details very clearly extracted where they weren't before. Interesting analysis was done by DP Review, which is a journal, well, not a journal, but a magazine, an online magazine. And they did this independent evaluation of our work in their labs, and they discovered that the Pixel 3 is, in fact, was the first smartphone camera to rival the resolution and quality of Micro Four Thirds cameras. And those Micro Four Thirds cameras are things that you can buy as standalone cameras. So we were very pleased to see that, and it was in fact what we were shooting for. Okay, so the story that I began with was that on the far right-hand side you've got these 35mm full frame cameras. On the left-hand side you've got the tiny 6mm sensor on a tiny mobile device. And this order, can it be disrupted? And what we've shown basically is it can be disrupted in the first step. That 6 mm sensor plus the software processing that we do allows you to super resolve to better than or equal to the Micro Four Thirds cameras. It was also shown that in certain cases we're actually getting very, very close to the APS-C 21 mm as well. Although I think that depends on the lighting conditions much more so. Obviously, these APS-C cameras can have much more sophisticated optics, which we don't really enjoy. Okay, so the results of this were published in SIGGRAPH 2019. This is the paper. There's a corresponding website that you're welcome to visit, read the paper, and give us feedback. So some of the use cases, I want to talk a little bit about some of the use cases to which this algorithm was put. One of them is night sight. Some of you may be familiar with this functionality. Some of the other phones on the market also have them nowadays. This allows us to take really long exposures by capturing multiple frames as long as 4 minutes or so, and mesh them together to get a very high quality night scene. These were pictures that were basically impossible before without having a much, much fancier camera. The reason why the super resolution algorithm here is very important is not necessarily to get super resolved pixels, but rather the stability and the robustness of the merge is what is used here to make sure that we don't get motion blur and various other artifacts that would be present in these extremely long exposures. The other use case to which this has been put is the zoom use case. So far, I described to you the top level, capture, alignment, merge, and enhancement. The super resolved pixels that we get here with additional detail come from this merge process, where we take advantage of the process that I just described to you. Now, if you, as I said, this output pixel could be as much as 2x the resolution of the input capture. But what if you want to go to higher resolution? We do that with zoom all the time, right? We turn the camera on and pinch and zoom and go as much as 5x, 10x, and maybe more with some devices. So the way that works is a part of the image is cropped, and that crop, that single frame crop, is then blown up or upscaled using what some call a single frame super resolution algorithm. More easily, we can just call it an upscaling algorithm. For this, we developed a totally separate method called Razor. And it was published, this was published actually before we did the multi-frame super resolution stuff. This method is based on a very lightweight machine learning framework. And the way it works is we take pairs of low and high resolution images of the same object, the same scene, and we extract respectively patches and pixels. And then we solve the least squares problem to come up with a filter. If you do this least squares for the entire image, of course, you can just set up a very simple least squares problem where the patches go into this matrix A, the pixels from the high res go into this vector B, and H contains a bunch of filter coefficients that you can solve for. If you solve for a single filter, that's not all that much better than just using something like a Lanczos interpolation. However, we can do much better. What we can do is to bucket similar patches together and train within these buckets. So effectively, we do a very simple clustering of the patches, and then we repeat the same least squares estimation problem for each cluster. And so that allows us to get a table of filters instead of a single filter. And then at inference time, this table of filters, so here's an example of what the table of filters looks like for 2x upscaling. This table of filters is parameterized by the gradient of the local gradient angle, the coherence of the gradients, and the strength of the gradients. Those are described in the paper in more detail, but suffice it to say these are very simple features that we use in order to get the, essentially get a hash key into this table And so for every pixel, we decide based on its local neighborhood which of the filters should be applied for upscaling. So let's pull this all together. Let me show you an example from our terrific Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. So here's a 2x zoom. And if I take a little piece of that image and show it to you, this is what standard digital zoom would look like. And this is kind of what our images looked like back in 2016 and 2017. So if we just do the single frame super resolution, if we don't do that multi-frame demosaicing first, this is what the image would look like. However, if we do the multi-frame merge and the single frame upscaling using the method that I just described, then we get these much better results. And so this hybrid of optical and digital zoom with the super resolution together is a feature that was launched on the Pixel phones called Super Res Zoom. It's been called the best hybrid optical digital zoom on the market. And it's allowed us over the course of a couple of years to significantly improve the quality of the zoomed images that come out of our Pixel phones. A few other things to say to close out my talk. Other challenges in computational imaging. I think one of the things that I've been excited about and we've worked on is this question of curation. Just as a historical matter, remember some of you may be old enough to recall that you had to buy a roll of film, 12 exposures, and you would spend a great deal of time working on producing a good set of images, and maybe out of the 12, 6 would come out pretty good. Then you could get 36 exposure rolls, and you would still work very, very hard, and only 6 of them would come out awesome, let's say. Now you have a memory card, and you can take thousands of exposures, and guess what? Still only 6 of them are awesome. So the net amount of awesome pictures hasn't really increased a whole lot. It's just that we have a lot more pictures. So curation has become a really important factor here. In this respect, we developed a neural network model that was trained on a great number of images that were rated by human raters for both aesthetic and technical quality. This allows you, this is a very broad structure of it, I'm not going to go into too many details, but it's basically based on existing architectures. And what it's able to do is to rank images of maybe the same scene, for example here, Eiffel Tower, by aesthetic quality. Now you can see the fancy looking images get the highest score, and the kind of blurry, darkish, hazy images get the lowest score. Now this is not intended to indicate any one individual's particular taste. This is an aggregate, and it should be understood and interpreted as such. But it gives us a rough idea and the ability to aesthetically rank some images. We can also rank images using the same network retrained for technical quality. And so here you can see my co-author, Hossein, the pictures that are kind of nicely in focus and well lit and so on and so forth score higher, and the blurry out of focus and so on rank lower. And so that basically brings me to the end of my talk. I want to thank you very much again for inviting me. It's been fun to record this, and I hope it has been fun for you to listen to it as well. Please feel free to contact me via email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if they're not covered in the live session. Thank you again.